Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Good to see you, Daniel.
Good morning, Dr. Paul. How are you?
I'm doing well on Martin Luther King holiday,
That's
or
right.
birthday.
No holiday for us.
Yes, and it's this is always interesting to me because over the many years, decades, I think my opinion changed. As I became more anti-war and less conservative and more libertarian, then there's some things in Martin Luther King's life that at one time I didn't like his economic policies. I wasn't a champion, not a champion now. But there's some other good stuff in his life, and that's why I think recognizing Martin Luther King is important. And we'll get into this a little bit, but the two big things is that he believed in nonviolence. He believed in civil disobedience, but no violence. And I believe one of the key reasons why he was murdered by our government was because he became anti-war and came out loud and clear and opposed Vietnam, which was heroic at the time. And of course, the other one that I've mentioned in the past on some of our programs was Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay, for not wanting to go over there and kill people that had never done him any harm. But for the most part, the pro-war movement, the deep state was very much in charge even back then. And of course, Martin Luther King was independent-minded. I believe that's the main thrust of how and why he got murdered.
And we both read an excellent article in The Intercept this morning that pointed out something really fascinating, which is when Martin Luther King Jr. turned against LBJ, President Johnson's foreign policy, the liberal establishment turned against him. They cited a poll. By 1966, 63% of Americans had a negative view of MLK. That was an absolute flip from a couple of years before. So his emphasizing violence overseas, in addition to violence at home, caused the establishment to flip on him.
And, back then, most people had the impression, well, the liberals were against the war, and New York Times and Washington Post would be, would be sympathetic because at the end they were against the war. But they were very much against the war, and they turned against LBJ. I mean, I turned against Martin Luther King because they were pro-war. And one of their pragmatic, utilitarian, wrongfully directed arguments was, well, LBJ, we might not like this war, but we can't offend LBJ. We have to give him support because look at what he gives us. He gives us all these welfare programs, and we need more money domestically, and that may rock the boat. He won't be our friend. And there was a lot of that going on, which was ridiculous. I mean, that in a way is saying, well, let's keep the war going on. We kill a few people, we spend and waste a little money, as long as they endorse the welfare state. And that to me was obscene. And that's why the liberal establishment, plus most of the civil rights organizations, turned against him as well. So he was a very unpopular person, at the time of his death.
And he said something very bold. It's hypocritical to preach nonviolence at home and to ignore U.S. government's violence overseas. And this, it was the April 1967 speech where he first really forcefully denounced U.S. involvement in Indochina. He was advised by his inner circle, don't bring this up, don't rock the boat. And he ignored them, and he did his own thing because he could not justify in his conscience opposing violence in one place but ignoring it somewhere else. And that was the beginning of his fallout with the establishment, really.
And for years, everybody just said it was a single person, James Earl Ray, but there's a lot of books been written now. And I guess a major turn was when they had this trial in Memphis in 1999, when the King family was pushing this. But the King family didn't succumb to this temptation to, justify what was going on. I mean, they came on the side that the government was involved, and various branches of the government, like the FBI, the police. I don't know whether the CIA was involved, but the Army was involved. involved. It was a true conspiracy, and it came out in this trial. And I don't think people have refuted that. And I think most people believe that we were very much involved. We, as to say loosely, our government was involved, just as they have been involved in most of the major killings in this country, assassination of leaders.
And it was a jury of 6 blacks and 6 whites that determined that the murder of Martin Luther King was a conspiracy involving the U.S. government, and it was primarily over his anti-war, anti-Vietnam War views. So that was a very significant event, I think.
Isn't it interesting, of course, Bobby Kennedy, interesting enough, when he was the Attorney General, had directed the spying for J. Edgar Hoover on Martin Luther King. So they weren't exactly buddies. But, just recently they had this major vote last week on FISA, which was further destruction of the Fourth Amendment. Matter of fact, this is what they've done since this bill probably is going to get passed. At least the House passed this. But who voted for it? We say, well, the liberals voted for it. Yeah, they did. A lot of conservatives voted for it. Once again, it was bipartisan because both sides endorse authoritarianism. There's liberal type authoritarianism, conservative type of authoritarianism. They come together so often in war and civil liberties. And in the House, it passed pretty much overwhelmingly to have more of this type of stuff going on, where not only do they conspire and plot, they assassinate people, and they've done this for years. So this is why, of course, we talked the other day about that vote on FISA courts, why this is the wrong way to go, and it was part of this spying that was going on. Hoover was not a civil libertarian. He's about the most opposite you could find.
But it does there does seem to be a parallel then between how Martin Luther King was received by the liberal establishment when he moved against the war, and also how we know the Republicans were going to be horrible for the most part on the extension of the NSA spying. We know they have unfortunately an authoritarian spirit, but it was the Democratic Party who made up the margin of victory for the extension of the NSA spying last week. So here you have the parallels, I think.
Another subject that has come up even recently on this because of the anniversary of his death or his birth. Clarence Jones was Martin Luther King's closest associate and his lawyer, and he's written about King's position on immigration. And even before he was killed in '68, he was all of 39 years old, immigration didn't have the intensity that it has today. It wasn't so massive. But he had a position that Thomas described as sort of wink and a nod. That Martin Luther King wasn't excited about it, but wasn't speaking out against it. But he says under today, his assessment, for having known King so well, his assessment was that King would be opposed to the massive immigration, but it would be an economic factor. He would be opposed because it would undermine the employment of poor blacks here. And yet, I don't hear too much of that on the evening news, that Martin Luther King might have been a little bit reserved on mass immigration.
Yeah, that is an interesting point, the economic argument. We talked about LBJ earlier, and we will definitely not quote what the Intercept quoted LBJ is saying. But basically, when King gave the speech in '67 turning against the war, LBJ is reported to have said, "What does that blankety blank want? We gave him the Civil Rights Act of '64, we gave him Voting Rights Act of '65, we gave him a war on poverty. What more does he want?" And really that shows, I think, the awesome power of the war machine. Look, we gave you all this stuff. Don't you dare interfere with our war, because that's where we get our goodies.
And that shows the power of the deep state, even back then. But there's in the presidential campaigns I was involved in, I always took a position. My position was I knew exactly what the Constitution said and what a libertarian society would be like, and that was my promise on how I'd vote. And I always wanted to state that position. And yet I wanted to work with people. I wanted to work with progressives who were like a Martin Luther King, who cared about privacy, who cared about civil liberties and anti-war and nonviolent demonstrations. So this I always supported. But then I thought, well, what would be a good position of working our way out? Of course, my position on working our way out of this economic mess, and the spending overseas and the spending domestically and the crisis I believe is coming, that if we had the right people and we wanted to, we could. In theory, we could. Politically, I don't think it'd be possible. But my argument would be that you cut this military spending, give up on the empire, and then there would be a lot of savings. So if we could save $100 billion in the military budget, which wouldn't be that tough, maybe you could tide people over this dependency, kids on medical care and all. In theory, the government only makes that worse. But at least politically, and you could temporarily tide things over by taking $100 billion, put $50 billion toward the deficit, and take care of the immediate needs here at home. And that could be worked out. It's not likely to happen, but it's one way where you could actually, work with progressives. But it looks like the progressives are on the team for war. They were, especially in Vietnam, and they're not. The military budget passes overwhelmingly left and right, and Republicans and Democrats. So that's not on the horizon. But I think always we should state the precise principle that we believe in about the use of violence by government, whether it's the use of violence overseas or whether it's the use of violence against the people here at home, both in an economic sense as well as a civil libertarian sense.
And it does seem like our argument with him might be about economics, about welfare and everything, but perhaps it's a flight of fancy. But I do wonder if Reverend King would have survived. If perhaps, so let's look at some of the evidence. He was certainly willing to buck the black establishment, which turned on him over his views on the war. Of course, the white liberal establishment essentially wanted to keep him on the plantation. We're going to give you these things, but don't you dare challenge the system, the deep state of war. I just wonder if King had survived, if he would have started to look at welfare as a way of also keeping blacks on the plantation. People like Thomas Sowell, who we admire so much, and Walter Williams, how they have been leaders in talking about how these programs really do hurt blacks. It's hard not to wonder whether he might have come to that conclusion as well.
And the atmosphere is so much better now because we do talk with progressives who become interested in monetary policy, and they see the conspiratorial nature of the Federal Reserve, how it helps the crony capitalists. And I would have found it fascinating to work with a Martin Luther King to see if he would listen. I think he would, especially when you can present a pretty good case to show how, the bankers and establishment and the military-industrial complex all helped, by the Federal Reserve and bailing out the rich versus the poor, that I would have found it fascinating because, there's so much that we could agree on and emphasize that, get out of these wars, stay at home, and also, if we're going to demonstrate, do it non-violently. So it would have been fascinating for me to at least make an effort to try to do that. And we've done that with good progressives in the last several years.
Absolutely, and we continue to do so. Here's a final quote that I saw, and I think it was in the article, but I thought this was really a powerful quote, and I think it is so relevant today. Just change Vietnam with the country of your choice. He says, Vietnam is a symptom of a far greater malady within the American spirit. And that's this aggressiveness, this militarism that's driven in. But I think the real inspiration of Martin Luther King is that he had everyone turning against him, including the people closest to him, questioning, why are you doing this? Why are you following your conscience on this? You're just going to make it hard for yourself. But he stuck to principle, and I think that is really something, a lesson for all of us when we feel like we have the whole country against us, left and right against us for being against war.
Well, and of course, you could say the same thing for Muhammad Ali,
Yes.
because he gave up a lot in order to stick to his principle of not going off and killing people that he had no hatred directed toward them. But I want to close off by just following up on this whole idea of libertarians and constitutionalists working with progressives and anti-war liberals. And there's not much of a coalition right now. It's out there, and there are some agreements, but we get frustrated at times because we offer to work with others, and some of them are afraid, well, we're afraid to talk to you guys. You guys believe in free markets, and you might infiltrate. But in the time of working on coalitions, you do it in the narrow sense of being developing a foreign policy and maybe a monetary policy that we can agree with. And this is something that we hope we can develop and get more progressives and liberals to come over and say, yes, we should get together. I think it's very necessary because the wars seem to be endless. Oh, they're not as big as Vietnam, but they're significant and they're threatening, and nuclear weapons are more involved than ever. This whole idea of the panic that just happened in Hawaii. And what about the comments just yesterday between the Pakistani and the Indians? I thought it had been sort of settled, they'd be calm, but they're starting to threaten each other. And that's why we need a much stronger coalition between the so-called conservative libertarian anti-war people along with the liberal progressive Democrats, to come together and form a base which can have some influence and send a message to Washington to change their attitude. Because I am convinced Washington is a reflection of the prerogatives and the desires and the prevailing attitudes of the people. And that is why, of course, one of the reasons why we have this program, trying to change people's attitudes so eventually they will be reflected in Washington. That should be our goal. So our goal remains, how do we promote peace and prosperity? And I say with the non-aggression principle, everybody commit to no initiation of violence. Wow, that would be a wonderful thing. And of course, the world could stand a little bit of that. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.